If you're curious about what's going on with your body as you enter perimenopause and menopause, I highly recommend staying tuned for today's interview. I speak with Dr. Debbie Rice, a naturopathic doctor who works for the DUTCH Test, or Precision Analytical. We talk about sex hormones like estrogen and progesterone and testosterone, and what happens to them as we get into this next phase of our life. We also talk about cortisol, its effects on our body, whether it's high or low, and we talk about liver detoxification. You're not going to want to miss today's episode. That's coming up right now. Welcome to the show, Dr. Debbie Rice. I am so happy to have you here.
So excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
So let's start with what you do and what are you passionate about in terms of testing?
Ooh, those are great questions. My name is Debbie Rice. I am the assistant medical director at DUTCH Test. So that's the dried urine test for comprehensive hormones. I also have a small practice on the side in Portland, Oregon. So I do see patients as well. And what am I passionate about with testing? I'm passionate about a lot of things. I'm passionate about healthcare, access to healthcare. So I think it's really important, even if you have the best care that you can give, if it's inaccessible, right? Like that's a problem. So I'm really passionate about access to healthcare and looking at like how we can get people healthcare, what they need, the testing that they need, the care that they need. So I'm a huge advocate for that as much as I can be. As far as testing, obviously I love the DUTCH test. It's one of the, I do feel, even though I work for DUTCH, I do feel like the DUTCH test is really an exceptional test, which is why I can stand behind it. I can get behind it and I get all excited about it too. And the DUTCH test does test. It's got its niche, right? Like we're not the stool testing people. We're not the genetics testing people. We are the people for sex hormones. So think estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, DHEA, and adrenal function. So cortisol as well as DHEA again. So we're looking at how does your body make these hormones? What does your body do with these hormones? And what are those levels? So I am passionate about that.
Thank you for that. I was actually going to say, can you tell us what the DUTCH test is? But you answered it pretty much, in terms of it. So where I'd like to start with is there's a lot of talk about testing. So you mentioned genetic testing. You mentioned there's blood testing, there's urine, there's saliva. Mm-hmm. I'd like to start with
the things.
What are the differences in them and how does the DUTCH test differ from all of those and in terms of getting those results? Because I think it's a good place for people to understand because some people have heard of what the DUTCH test is. Some people have never heard of it. People may have heard of saliva versus urine. So let's start right off the bat explaining what the differences are.
Yeah, absolutely. So the DUTCH test, so DUTCH stands for dried urine testing of comprehensive hormones. So it is a dried urine test. And what that means is when you do your test collection or when you do your collection, you get these little cards. They're kind of like the size of a business card and you can open it up and there's this little filter paper in there and you pee either directly on that or you can pee in a cup and dip it so that you get the urine on that strip and then you let it dry. Once that is all dry, you send it to the lab. We're able to reconstitute and pull that urine with all of the hormones into what we need to analyze the data. That is dried urine testing, which is very different than like the urine testing that you think of with like the jug that you walk around and you pee in, and then you pee, put it in the fridge, pee, put it in the fridge, right? Like that's different. That's like they call it a 24-hour urine. And you still get really great information from that as well. That's 24-hour urine. And then you have serum, which is the same thing as blood testing. So that's your standard blood draw or blood poke, depending on what type of testing you're doing. And then there is salivary testing. So salivary testing can be used for a couple of different things. I would say generally it's considered a gold standard for free cortisol testing. That's the one that like you spit in the little tube and they give you your cortisol values. You can also do salivary testing for sex hormones like estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. A lot of times genetic tests are done through saliva swabs, right? So those are generally the different kinds of tests that are available. Now, when we look at DUTCH tests compared to other testing avenues, because the DUTCH test is more focused on sex hormones and adrenal function, the other ways that you can test that would be through 24-hour urine, salivary testing, or serum/blood testing. And the difference between all of those is what you can get. And I will say that the DUTCH test becomes one test where you can get your estrogen level, progesterone levels, testosterone, DHEA, cortisol. And you also not just get the value of what that estrogen or cortisol is, you also see what those hormones are doing in your body. We call those metabolites. And that's where you get this difference of what do you get between like a 24-hour urine versus a blood draw of estrogen, let's say, right? So if you just wanted to know an estradiol value and you didn't want to know anything else about it, a blood test is great for that, right? Like you can do it quick, you get it, it's great. But you don't get the metabolites or what the body is doing with all of that estrogen. So you can get that in a 24-hour urine, or you can also get that in a DUTCH test. And it's interesting for the Canadian providers that I have talked to, a lot of Canadian practitioners will do a 24-hour urine so that they get all of the metabolites of estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, but they'll also do a serum or a blood draw so they can see like the estradiol, progesterone, testosterone, and they will also do a salivary test to look at what cortisol is doing throughout the day. The DUTCH test combines all of the good parts of all of those. So you get all of that in one test instead of having to do like a 3-stop shop to get that diurnal pattern of cortisol. So when we're testing cortisol, the best way to test cortisol is to do what is called like a 4-spot or a 5-spot sample. What that means is those 4-spot or 5-spot is you collect it 4 or 5 times throughout the day because we want to see what that cortisol is doing throughout the day. You can do a blood test of cortisol, but blood cortisol is bound and it's not free and available. So it's not a really great representation of what is free and available or how your cortisol is acting throughout the day. So salivary and dried urine testing are a better way to go with that because you can collect multiple times throughout the day so we can see what that curve is, because that's going to be the biggest chunk or meat of the information that we want to get from cortisol.
You mentioned the word metabolites. Can you explain
Yes.
what that means? Because I think for some people listening, they'd be like, well, I don't really understand what a metabolite is and why does it matter?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say even when I first heard metabolites, I was like, that sounds very sciencey. I don't know what that means. Essentially, for a good understanding of that is really what the rest of estrogen is doing in your body, for example. So we think of estrogen, right? When we think of estrogen, we're generally thinking of what's called estradiol. That's the main or most potent estrogen in our body. The metabolites are what happens to estrogen after it goes through its little, doorway keyhole to do what it needs to do. So it's more of like the downstream or bigger story of what estrogen is doing in the body. That's what those metabolites are. Same thing with testosterone, same thing with DHEA, same thing with progesterone, same thing cortisol. So it's more of the bigger picture of what continues to happen with those hormones in the body. They have actual values. We just need to see once they have those values, like where they fall, right? Like what does that, it's almost like looking at, I kind of compare it to lifting the hood of a car, right? Like you can see, right, you have a Mercedes, but you want to see what the engine looks like. That's what the metabolites are for estrogen, right? Like your Mercedes is estrogen, under the hood is what the metabolites are. So it's just a deeper picture into what happens after estrogen does its main job.
So as we, when we're premenopausal and then we're peri and then we're menopausal, and Morphus is speaking to women who are in perimenopause and menopause. So whether you're listening on the podcast or whether you're watching here on YouTube, highly recommend that you share this with as many people as you can, because I really believe that testing is so critical. Because I often hear, I've got a nice TikTok page where I talk a lot, it's all I talk about is menopause there. And the question that keeps coming up for women is, how do I know if I'm in perimenopause? How do I know if I'm in menopause? Now we know 12 months without a period, that's kind of the general marker for menopause, but perimenopause can be anywhere from 2 to 12 years, right? Prior to being in menopause. So
absolutely,
would something like the DUTCH test be a test? Because we know that getting a blood test, and we've had many doctors who've shared this as well, is that it's only a snippet in time. So it's a very hard indicator in terms of saying, well, I don't know, you might be in perimenopause. Let's look at your symptoms. Would you say that getting a DUTCH test can be a definitive way of determining whether you are, pre, peri, or menopausal?
I will say with perimenopause, I'm going to put a little disclaimer there, because perimenopause, you have so many irregularities that can happen. So you have a lot of changes with your estrogen and progesterone. So you have these significant variabilities between your estrogen and progesterone and how the body is signaling for that. I do feel like the DUTCH test is helpful because I believe in test, don't guess. And even though symptoms are very important, right? Like they're absolutely part of the clinical picture, testing helps you understand that. Now, I would not say that one DUTCH test would be definitive, but if you are doing symptom evaluation, you do a preliminary DUTCH test, and then you continue to kind of monitor with testing, you get a better idea of what that looks like. But because there is such variability, and I think that's where you would look into, yep, I would definitely categorize you as perimenopausal, that consistent variability, right? Like if you are premenopausal, you are having regular cycles, predictable cycles generally. Once you are postmenopausal, you are no longer having cycles, right? Like that is also predictable. The perimenopause is the very unpredictable part. And I will also say this, the hard thing about perimenopause is the symptoms of perimenopause can also mimic significant hormone imbalance. So even if you are premenopausal and you're having irregular cycles, you want to look at hormone imbalance, stress related likely, that can mimic perimenopause. And so I wouldn't say that any testing would be definitive, but the DUTCH testing would certainly help us understand what that hormone picture looks like. One of the things that I try to tell my patients is our ovaries have a life, right? And when they're ready to retire, they take their beers, they go to the beach. The adrenal glands have to take over. So your adrenal glands become your second ovaries. We want to make sure that we understand what the adrenal glands are doing, so that, because your adrenals aren't going to care if they are stressed out, they're worried about one foot in front of the other, getting you up for your day, like making sure that you're safe. They don't care about hot flashes, night sweats, sex drive. They don't care about that, right? So we want to make sure that your adrenal glands, your cortisol production, your DHEA is nice, healthy, and stable. And that's going to be part of that hormone evaluation when we're looking at perimenopause or even leading up to perimenopause. It's not a bad idea to understand what your baseline is going into perimenopause, as well as checking out what your hormone overall presentation looks like, either deep into perimenopause or kind of, gliding in to perimenopause.
I actually think what you just said was brilliant, because we do know that the adrenal glands take over for the ovaries. But the issue is so many of us, I'd say probably most of us, are so stressed going into that phase of life, right?
Absolutely.
So already our adrenal glands are so taxed already that we're coming into it as with an issue because of the fact that we are living our lives and we're constantly in that sympathetic mode and our nervous system is so taxed. So I feel like having a DUTCH test or getting that DUTCH test prior to, even if you're in that peri mode, or just understanding what that benchmark is. So that way you could take care of those adrenal glands. And I know it's not an easy thing to do, we now know though, meditation and walks in nature, like anything that's going to stimulate the parasympathetic is so key. And I talk so much about lifestyle, but really keeping that, trying to, not be constantly in that sympathetic mode will be very helpful. So what do you recommend? So you get a benchmark, wherever you're at. So wherever you are, whatever age you are listening to this, whether you are pre, peri, or post, get a benchmark. And then when you suspect you're in that peri mark, you can always do another test, I guess. And then how much time after that would you recommend? Because you said it's a good kind of starting point. Would it be a year later doing another one, 6 months? What would be your recommendation?
Yeah. And I think that this is going to depend on the person, right? So I think it depends on their stress. I think it depends on what the supplementation is and how they feel with that supplementation. With a DUTCH test, I usually recommend at least 3 months before retesting, because we want to allow for whatever supplementation, lifestyle adjustments you are going to do to take effect. And then we can see what that result looks like. And then depending on how you're feeling, if we need to adjust anything, what that symptom presentation looks like, you can test a year later, which I think is a pretty good idea. Once you feel like you're pretty stable, doing another test anywhere from 9 to 12 months later, I feel is quite fair, especially if you are continuing to burn the candle, hopefully not at both ends.
Right. So, yeah. Which is, that's a fair amount of time. Let's talk cortisol. because there's a lot of talk about, especially in the perimenopause and menopause world about, our cortisol is too high, our cortisol is too low. Can you give us a little bit of an education about cortisol and why it's so important when it comes to managing perimenopausal and menopausal symptoms?
Absolutely. Yeah. So all of the hormones that we test on the DUTCH test, that's going to include cortisol, are what I call Goldilocks hormones. And the reason I say that is because if you have too much, it's a problem. If you have too little, it's a problem. Because I feel like we get in this like, ooh, cortisol's bad. Like poor cortisol gets this, it's so demonized. And as much as we don't want too much cortisol, we also need cortisol to be able to manage our metabolism, right? So your adrenal glands and your thyroid gland are best friends. They work together on a daily basis to make sure that your metabolism is able to keep up with the stress that you are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So, and cortisol is very responsive. So I always tell my patients your adrenal glands are like a puppy. The reason I say that is because your adrenal glands like routine. Right. So, and the same thing with a puppy, right? They know when it's time to wake up. They know when it's time to go for their walk. They know when it's time for dinner. They know when it's time for bed. Same thing with your adrenal glands. They do so much better when you have, as you said, lifestyle support, right? You know that you're getting up around the same time every morning. Your blood sugar is stable throughout the day. So however that looks for you, some people eat every 2 hours, some people do intermittent fasting. It has to be individual for you. Cortisol responds to changes in blood sugar. So you need to make sure that your blood sugar is stable. That's part of your health house, right? Like you need to make sure that your health house is strong. Physical activity is going to be a major contributor to that. And I'm not talking about, well, I garden. That's great. That's probably helpful for stress management, but you need to also have purposeful movement, right? So it doesn't matter if you're working a lot during the day, you have to have purposeful movement because that routine is going to influence how your cortisol and your stress responds to that. And sleep. I cannot say that enough. Sleep is going to be one of the biggest things to influence that diurnal rhythm for you and how your body responds to stress, how your body is able to continue to respond to stress, right? Like if you're not sleeping, you're not able to get that reset from growth hormone to be able to reset that response for you, as you were talking about before with the sympathetic versus parasympathetic. A lot of us, even if you were to take a week off of work, if you still live in a city, our old brain knows this. It can sense Wi-Fi, it can sense 5G, 4G, 3G, lights from the city, sounds from the city, planes. It keeps it at this low hum level of awareness. So your sympathetic nervous system is always on. You need to be able to have a good balance or counterbalance with that for parasympathetic, which means we need to work even a little bit harder to make sure that we can have that parasympathetic, sympathetic balance. Because if you're always in sympathetic, that's going to be dangerous for you. It's helpful if you're running from a saber-toothed tiger, but you can't do that all the time. Your body can't keep up with that. And so that's where cortisol is going to be very important in helping to manage and balance all of that for you.
A lot of women in perimenopause and menopause suffer from sleep issues. So when you say, getting a good night's sleep, my brain goes to, oh my gosh, that's so many women are not getting that good night's sleep. How does that affect our cortisol levels as we're in this stage of life? And how could we manage it better? Like, what are some things that we can do?
Yeah, great question. As you said before, lifestyle things are going to be important. So making sure that you are doing all of the good sleep hygiene things so that you're not doing excitatory activities in the evening. You're off your phone at least an hour before bed. Screen time, right? So the blue light can actually affect your melatonin and your body's ability to release melatonin. So all of that's going to be helpful. Physical activity, purposeful physical activity helps to reset that circadian rhythm for you. That's going to be important. The cortisol. So cortisol and melatonin are your daytime and nighttime hormones. Cortisol has to have this rise in the morning and then fall throughout the day so that it can pass the baton to melatonin. So the melatonin can do its job and rise at night so you can sleep. If you don't have an appropriate rise in the morning, you don't have an appropriate fall, melatonin doesn't get the appropriate signal to do its job. And if you don't have good sleep, then your cortisol in the morning is either going to over respond, or generally, this is more of what I see, it's not going to be able to have the oomph to respond because you haven't had enough good sleep. So you do get this big effect of cortisol if you're not getting to sleep early enough or if you're not getting enough sleep. And I know that will already start to stress people out because they're like, I'm just trying to sleep. Part of that is going to be hormone evaluation, right? Like as your hormones change, right, your estrogen affects your sleep, your progesterone affects your sleep, testosterone, same thing. So you want to be, I would say, preventative or proactive in evaluating what your hormones look like so you can anticipate that. And then also ensuring that you are having that balance of sympathetic versus parasympathetic, right? Like you are having that good cortisol balance, blood sugar balance, physical activity, all of those things.
Right. What role does melatonin? Because one thing that I've noticed, and again, I always talk about I'm an N of one. One thing that I've noticed is prior to being in perimenopause, when I would take melatonin, I was like, it didn't work for me. Like, I was like, yeah, doesn't do it for me. But now that I'm in menopause, can I tell you, it is part of my nighttime routine. Like I literally find taking melatonin makes a big difference. Now, I do know that my cortisol rises, between that 3 to 5 a.m. sometimes. And I do what I can to keep it, because I'm always testing and I've done the DUTCH test and I just know now, right, of all the research over the last, 4.5, 5 years, understanding it better. So would a hack be, if you're saying that kind of the passing of that baton, would a hack be for women in perimenopause and menopause to supplement with melatonin?
So I think melatonin supplementation is totally fine. I know that there are some people that say you shouldn't supplement with melatonin, but we have found that melatonin, at least my understanding is that melatonin supplementation is not suppressive. And so if you are struggling with sleep, you can certainly try melatonin. I do have some patients that, depending on how their body does with melatonin, it can make them feel super groggy, or some people can have nightmares with it. If that is the case, melatonin precursors like 5-HTP or tryptophan might be a better option. So then your body can just make the melatonin from those building blocks instead. But it can, like you said, be a game changer, right? Like when your body is going through these changes, the way that estrogen and serotonin communicate with each other can change. Your body needs estrogen to make serotonin. When you lose estrogen, you don't have as much serotonin to contribute to melatonin. So you see this, right? Like there's this like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. And then that way you can also support that serotonin pathway for melatonin.
That's great advice. So do either the precursor or taking melatonin. And I do think the amount is important too, because I know, for myself, 3 milligrams of melatonin works. If I take 6, it's too much. I know someone else who takes 9 and it works great. So we're all individual. And I think, experimenting is really key in listening to our body. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Which is really important. So I want to go back to estrogen for a second. So I know that there are different types of estrogen in the body, and you mentioned the most well-known, which is estradiol. So let's talk about the types of estrogen that we have. What happens when we get into perimenopause and menopause? So our estrogen starts to fall, our testosterone, like just if you can talk about the progesterone starts to fall. If you could talk a little bit about that hormone imbalance that starts to happen, I'd love to start there and then have some questions after that.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of times what we see is that progesterone, because progesterone is really, we rely more on progesterone for only really the second part of our cycle. So it doesn't have the same kind of presence in our cycle as estrogen does, right? Like we get a big bump of estrogen the first part of our cycle, and then we get a little bump of estrogen the second part of our cycle. But progesterone ends up being part of only the second part of the cycle. So a lot of times when we start to see those hormone shifts, it's because progesterone is starting to kind of weaken and the signaling for progesterone may not be as strong. And because it's only part, that second part of the cycle, it ends up kind of dropping off sooner or quicker than estrogen does. So a lot of times when we're looking at that hormone change with perimenopause, it's a drop in progesterone. We rely on progesterone for ovulation. And so when we stop producing as much progesterone, we're no longer ovulating anymore. And you can have cycles that you aren't ovulating. So even if you're bleeding, you may not be ovulating. It depends on how that progesterone signaling is going. Now, because of that, like once progesterone progesterone starts to wane out, progesterone is really important in helping to balance estrogen and the effect of estrogen. So once you start to lose that progesterone, estrogen can sometimes get a little more excited, and you can sometimes get a little bit more bursts of estrogen that happen because it doesn't have the progesterone to like regulate it. And more estrogen or too much estrogen can start to lead to like those hot flashes, night sweats, sleep issues, more PMS type symptoms, more emotional, breast tenderness, even cramping. And you can have more consistent estrogen than progesterone, which can also lead to more irregular cycles, whether it's longer cycles or even closer to like, then you were like, well, now I'm bleeding like every 2 weeks, or maybe I'm just spotting all the time, right? Because you don't have that progesterone to balance that estrogen. Testosterone has more of a, instead of having a cyclical rise and fall, testosterone is a little bit more consistent. And depending on your adrenal presentation, that can really highly influence your testosterone. What happens as the ovaries decide, take their retirement, is that testosterone relies on your adrenal function to be made. So you get testosterone from the adrenal glands, and then we rely on testosterone to convert into estrogen postmenopausally. So if you have low levels of testosterone going into menopause or even perimenopause, your estrogen may be further lowered because you don't have the gas in the tank to offer to estrogen. So when we're looking at this kind of transition that happens, we want to make sure that we can support our DHEA and testosterone production, because those are precursors to your estrogen as it starts to fall. So in that perimenopausal time frame, you might see these little bumps of progesterone, but eventually the progesterone kind of spaces out. And then estrogen may get a little excited, may not. And then, so you'll see these little like peaks and valleys of estrogen. And then all of a sudden you'll start to see it kind of wane out as well. And so that's essentially what we see with estrogen and progesterone. And we have E1, E2, and E3 as our estrogen. So E2 is estradiol. That's the most potent form, especially in cycling females. Now, E1 is what is directly converted from testosterone. E1 and E2, or E1 is also called estrone, can convert back and forth into each other. But we look a lot at the E1 or the estrone for peri and postmenopausal females to see what that looks like in that conversion to estrogen. E3 is also part of that kind of what we call the primary estrogen. So you have E1, E2, and E3. E3 is also known as estriol. Now, estriol is a very weak estrogen, but it's also helpful for lubrication. So estriol is one of those things that we think of for like vaginal dryness. The vaginal cells love E3. They will just like drink it up to help with hydration. So there is a lot of, I would say, supplementation of E3 vaginally, especially as we start to go into having some of the symptoms of vaginal dryness and maybe not feeling as comfortable vaginally. E3 is really great for that. And because it's a weak estrogen, it's considered a little bit more on the safe side, I will say.
So Debbie, I had my genetics done, my genetics tested, and I know that, I want to go a little bit more into, E2, you talked about the estradiol, the E4, the E16. So can you talk a little bit about the metabolites? We're going back to the metabolites now, and really understanding when our estrogen breaks down in our body, which again, the DUTCH test will help us figure out, genetic testing will help you figure that one as well, is understanding what what E2 is, E2 you mentioned, but what's E4, what's E16, how does that all work, and why is it important at this stage of life?
Yes, absolutely. So E1 and E2 will break down into these estrogen metabolites. There is a 16-OH, a 4-OH, and a 2-OH. So these guys, the 16, 4, and 2-OH are part of what we call your phase 1 metabolism. When we talk about phase 1 metabolism, these phases are in the liver. So when your body makes these hormones, they have to go through the liver to be metabolized or detoxed so that your body can get rid of the bad things, keep, processing the good things. The 16-OH the 4-OH and the 2-OH are necessary, right? They're pathways that have to be done through estrogen metabolism. But as with anything in our body, some things are good and some things are not so good. So when we look at the good part of estrogen metabolism, the 2-OH is the most preferred pathway for estrogen metabolism. And the reason for that is this all has to do with how your estrogen receptors bind and are released. So when your body binds to estrogen, it's doing that so that it can help with detoxification, but it has to let go of that estrogen so then your body can continue to process it. If your body stays holding on to these estrogens, that's where it can become problematic. And when we look at the 2-OH, the 4-OH, and the 16-OH, this is really all about how well the body is able to hold on and then release these estrogens for clearance. The 2-OH is actually a really gentle bond with the estrogen receptors. And so once it's going through that liver, right, like it's going through its little bathing of phase 1 metabolism, once it's, cleared, it can pop off of that estrogen receptor really easily to get cleared. The 4-OH is considered the most naughty of all of these because it has the strongest bond, which means when it grabs onto that estrogen receptor, is going through its little, car wash in the liver, it's really difficult to let go of. And so that's where if your body's not able to let go of it, it can start to be naughty, cause a little bit of damage to your other DNA cells for estrogen. The 16-OH is what we call like middle of the road. So it's not as dangerous as the 4-OH, but it's not as preferred as the 2-OH. And the bond for that one is middle. So it has to work a little bit harder to, get off, but once it's off, it's fine. So it's really about binding capacity and how well the body's able to clear all of those things. The 2-OH, easily cleared. The 4-OH takes a little bit more, and then the 16-OH is kind of in between. What we want to have with that is a big chunk of all of those estrogen metabolites. We want a big chunk of that to go to the 2-OH. We want a little tiny bit of that to go to the 4-OH, and then a little bit more of that to go to the 16-OH. So when we're looking at that, and the DUTCH test will show this, right? Like how much of those metabolites or those hormones are being split, and is that split appropriately? How is your body metabolizing that? Do you need support in helping your body to metabolize that? So that's what we look at in the DUTCH test, and that's what you want evaluated, right? Like, are you making the good kind, or are you making naughty estrogens?
And I think that's so important, especially if you're considering hormone therapy, whether that's
absolutely
conventional or whether that's BHRT, right? So, and I think that's one of the, to me, that's why the DUTCH test is so critical, because it's actually going to tell you how you're metabolizing your estrogens. And so the good news is, though, and I want to hear this from you, is that if you, let's say, for example, like I know someone like myself, I metabolize a very large amount into my 4-OH, and we need to do certain things to get it from so you can get your 4-OH to convert to that 2, correct? What are some things that we can do that can actually make it convert to that 2, or that healthier estrogen?
Yeah. And I would say like lifestyle things in general, right? Like less inflammatory foods, cruciferous vegetables are going to be super helpful there. The food family of the Apiaceae family, that's going to be like carrots and parsnips. Those kinds of things are all going to be helpful. Fatty acids, omega-3s, all of those are going to help. Fiber is also going to help with kind of clearing some of those estrogens too. Things that can really optimize your phase 1 metabolism for estrogens. Sulforaphane actually going to be helpful for both phase 1 and phase 2, which is methylation. That's another part of your estrogen metabolism. That's like the second dock in the liver. Rosemary is really great for that. Calcium D-glucarate. DIM can be an option. The one thing that I like to warn about DIM is that DIM is part of the broccoli family. It's like concentrated broccoli. Can also lower estrogen. And I know that there are a lot of people that will say, oh, if there's anything going on with estrogen, just take DIM. You want to be careful about that because DIM lowers estrogen. If you already have low estrogen, it can sometimes make your symptoms worse. Mm-hmm. So that's where you want to be able to evaluate what are your estrogen levels, especially relative to your progesterone, because it's not just about estrogen and estrogen metabolism. It's about the balance of your estrogen with your progesterone, testosterone, right? So it's looking at all of those things. But like rosemary, calcium D-glucarate, sulforaphane, DIM, Those are going to be the big ones. Milk thistle as just an overall general phase 1 support and metabolizer can be helpful.
So it's really crucial that we support our liver in perimenopause.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yes.
Would you say that's really one of probably the most critical place to start?
Yeah. And our poor liver, I mean, when we're young and, indestructible, we can do anything, our liver recovers. But as we start to get older, we have to remember that we also need to treat our liver nicely. It has treated us very nicely, right? We want to give back.
You want to get back. And also it's the master detox in the body, and it's going to detox these estrogens like you're talking about. So keeping it working properly is going to help with so there's 2 phases, like you mentioned, of the liver detoxification. So that's what's really key. In terms of, everything we talked about, is there anything that we didn't cover that you feel is super important about the DUTCH test and making sure that you're understanding your sex hormones and your cortisol and your DHEA?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is another part of the DUTCH test. So there's a little kind of like bonus with the DUTCH test that looks at some organic acids. So on the DUTCH test, because we do focus a lot on detoxification, your body's ability to manage stress, and even oxidative stress, we do also test those things with the DUTCH test. It's part of the organic acid. So we look at B12, 2 markers for B6, glutathione. Glutathione is a very powerful antioxidant. We do look at some neurotransmitter metabolites, which are part of that sleep and stress response. We look at melatonin levels, and we also look at what's called the 8-OH or 8-hydroxy marker. This measures oxidative stress. So this tells us how aged your cells are, right? Like how stressed out your cells are. So that's also part of the test. We're looking at your body's ability to, like, your response to stress, your body's ability to deal with stress. Same thing with your estrogen, right? The estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. How well is your body able to maneuver and process through those hormones for you?
It's so excellent. Is there research behind the DUTCH test? Because I've heard, rumblings that, some people are like, oh, there's no research to support it and it's not backed by science. Is it backed by science? And what is science telling us about the DUTCH test?
Yeah, we do have some great research, especially if you are research oriented. We have some white papers that talk through salivary cortisol testing versus dried urine cortisol testing, what that looks like. As a lot of the research supports salivary testing for cortisol as the gold standard. We have great comparative research and literature on the website. We also have great research about DUTCH testing for estrogen, progesterone, testosterone in our white papers on the DUTCH test. So if you on DUTCHtest.com, if you go there and look under resources and data that's available there, all of our white papers are available to review, to look at that research comparison and studies there.
I love it. I'm so happy I got it done. Like, it literally opened up my eyes to so many different things.
It's a lot. And I will say this, like, it is definitely a complex test. So when you look at it, don't freak out, right? Like when you see your first report, you're like, oh my goodness. It is a lot of information. And that's why we encourage people, as much as we have clinical consultants at the lab, we are not allowed to consult with patients, which is why we try to make sure that you are teamed up with a practitioner that can walk you through, because it's so much information, so much helpful information, and you can get so much benefit from it. We want you to be well guided with it as well. Because if you have the tools, but you don't have, the ability to utilize those tools, it's not as helpful. So we want to be able to offer that information for you as well.
And for those of you who are interested in trying or getting a DUTCH test, we offer it. I'm a practitioner, so you can get it. We're going to put the link below. You can order it, whether you're watching on YouTube or you're watching in our Morphus for Menopause podcast. You can access it through the link below and order it. And I highly recommend it. I mean, I love, get it, just test, don't guess. Like, to me, it's such an important mantra, because we're so unique and individual. So what works for me may not work for you, vice versa. And people who follow me on TikTok know that I say that it's like literally my mantra, because we're all individual. So, genetic makeup and, living life and who we are, and then test, it's just, So I love the DUTCH test because it tells us what's going on over that 24-hour period. And it's important to understand it. And then you can retest it. So you said, don't get scared. I love that, because you could change it, right? So once you know the information, then you can change it. You could take supplements, eat certain foods, Would you say that for those who have, let's say, low estrogen, would eating phytoestrogenic foods or taking lignans, would that be something that can help?
For some people, yeah, I have some patients that respond really well to phytoestrogens and even dietary phytoestrogens. So soy is the big one, just making sure that you're getting good, sustainable, healthy, yes, soy options. But yeah, absolutely. I have some people that just even through diet can make a big difference in their hormone presentation.
And would that change the numbers on the DUTCH test? So let's say, for example, they have low estrogen or low testosterone and they want to start, taking maca, for example. Like, are there things that can make a difference with the DUTCH? Yeah. Okay.
It could. Yeah. It will likely not be as dramatic as like hormone supplementation, but you can certainly see things change with supplementation. Absolutely.
Perfect. Interesting. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Debbie Rice. It's this has been fascinating. I love it. And I'm so happy that DUTCH Test is around. Thank you for doing what you do. And thank you for educating us.
Of course. Thank you. I'm happy to help, and I'm so honored to be here. Thanks, Andrea.
And where can people learn more about you? And if they want to find out information about you or reach out to you on social media?
Yeah, you can always check into DutchTest.com. My information is on there, but I am also on Instagram as Dr.RiceDebbie.
Perfect.
It's because there are a lot of Rices out there and a lot of Debbies.
Perfect. Well, we're going to put it's below your name anyway, so people can access it there. And I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Such an interesting interview with Dr. Rice. And I absolutely agree with her. Test, don't guess, because there's so much going on at this stage of our life in perimenopause and menopause that it takes the guesswork out of it. So grab yourself a DUTCH test. The link is below. I highly recommend it. It's really eye-opening. I had my own done recently and I was wowed. I thought I knew a lot, but after getting my test done, I'm like, wow, absolutely fascinating information. If you got value out of today's interview, please share it with everybody you know and care about, because the more we share shows you care. I'm Andrea Donsky. Thanks for watching our Morphus for Menopause podcast and show. See you next time.